Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, we're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally as important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else. Not in the media and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on another edition of Illinois Rising. My co-host this week is Hilary Gowins. She's the managing editor of the Illinois Policy Institute, illinoispolicy.org. Hilary, thanks for joining us.
Great to be back with you, Dan.
Appreciate it. One of the big stories over the last couple of weeks, the politics of the minimum wage. Governor Jerry Brown of California, Moonbeam, signed a $15 minimum wage, saying this, very interesting, because Jerry Brown's actually had a lot of different positions on the minimum wage depending on the politics at the time. He said, it may not make sense economically, but it makes sense politically. That is just such a rich statement on the state of affairs within the Democrat Party and their efforts to continue to use this kind of rather low expectation blunt instrument of a minimum wage to maintain the political coalition they need to win states like California, New York, and perhaps the nation.
Yeah, it's a nice way to govern, using intentions and not results.
Well, somebody who is an expert on the topic is Jared Meyer. He is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He is also the co-author of a book that came out last year, Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young. That seems like a timely topic in consultation with in connection, I should say, with the minimum wage. Jared, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So one organization, the American Action Forum, estimates that the $15 an hour minimum wage, the increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour in California will cost taxpayers in California $3.6 billion more annually in government pay alone and nearly 700,000 private sector jobs. Boy, if the minimum wage is as bad as free market types like us say it is, then why is it so popular?
Well, I think it's because everyone with a heart wants to give their neighbors a raise. If it was really easy, as just government decreeing that everyone gets a raise, then maybe I'd be all for increasing the minimum wage. But the reality is quite different. If you raise the minimum wage, you're raising barriers to people gaining work experience. And it's no coincidence that over half of people who earn the minimum wage are under 25 and two-thirds work part-time. We need to keep this option open for workers who want to get an entry point into the workforce.
And one of the problems, too, when you talk about the stats like Dan just talked about, the raise is immediate, but the job losses are over the long term. Explain that in just plain language so people understand what that work looks like.
Well, what we've seen in the past is with small increases in the minimum wage, it doesn't lead immediately to massive job losses. Where you see the biggest effect is over time in how businesses expand or the rate that they create jobs. So that's where you get a lot of the estimate of job losses. But it is important to point out that a $15 an hour minimum wage is the highest in the world. Nowhere else is even close. If we adjust for purchasing power parity, it's about $10.40 in France is the highest wage. So we're really getting into uncharted territory. And I think with a $15 an hour wage, once it's fully phased in, there will be massive job losses.
And you have some people who are familiar with job creation and managing large workforces speaking in plain language about this, too. Former McDonald's CEO Ed Rensi told Fox Business this week, you talk about going from an average wage of $10 to $15 for a new minimum. You're talking about a 50% increase in wages. He said, look, that's a job killer, plain and simple.
Yeah, and if you look at the statistics for Illinois, the statewide median wage is $18 an hour. So now all of a sudden you're going to be wiping out a lot of jobs that are earning less than that. I mean, about 40% of people in Illinois are earning about $15 an hour. And it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about raising the minimum wage, you know, some people who keep their jobs, the ones who would have gotten a raise down the line anyways, they might be fine. But other people who are losing a job, that's who we need to keep in mind, or being kept out of the workforce. Because the real minimum wage is often said is $0 an hour. Employers don't have to hire.
Yeah, and just to stick on the fast food perspective on this too, because these rich franchisees can afford to raise the wages a couple bucks, be forced to in this case, or the rich corporate, the rich corporations can do the same. The head of White Castle in New York said about New York joining California to the $15 minimum wage. We're disappointed. What this means for White Castle is we really have to evaluate how we manage our business. About 30% of every sales dollar covers the pay of our hourly workers, and that doesn't include management. It's our biggest investment, our biggest cost, and if it's one that we see increase dramatically through fiat and we don't do anything, then our business model is unsustainable.
And I think that kind of gets to the point. Right now, when people want to raise the minimum wage, they're really targeting the fast food industry. And what they forget is that raising it to $15 an hour loops in a lot of people in other industries who maybe have a 2-year degree or have a technical degree, and they're still earning under $15 an hour. So you're going to see costs raised throughout the economy. But the real reason we're seeing this push, though, is unions need more members. That's why they're funding this, quote-unquote grassroots fight. And then once the minimum wage increase goes through, as it just did in California, now they're turning all their attention to lobby to get collectively bargained agreements exempted from the minimum wage. So unions fight for this, then they try to exempt their own members from having to be paid the minimum wage.
So speaking of unions, the SEIU, which has spent about $70 million on its Fight for 15 campaign, has been in and around Chicago recently. The Illinois Policy Institute's offices are actually near one of the McDonald's where they've implemented a cafe kiosk, which is an employee-free way to deliver customers what they want. So how are businesses going to respond? Is there going to be more automation? Are we going to see more of this?
That's one thing you constantly hear, and when labor costs go up, it does make sense to then invest capital into automation. But I think the main thing that we're going to see is that over time, people will think twice about starting a new franchise, which, keep in mind, it's not McDonald's who owns all these stores. The vast majority of their stores, I think they want to get it to over 90% fairly soon, are owned by individuals. So it's going after small business owners. It's not going after a large multinational corporation.
And we were talking about compassion for your fellow man, and we all want to be compassionate, but within the bounds of sound economics. October survey of New York Council of Nonprofits, which is an Albany-based trade organization for nonprofits, social service providers, indicated that the financial viability of 49% of the state's nonprofits would be threatened by a minimum wage increase to $15 an hour.
Exactly. So that's another case of other industries that aren't the target of these unionization efforts being kind of thrown underwater along with the fast food industry. At least New York, when it was first raising its minimum wage just by the governor's decree, it was only for fast food restaurants, so that made it clear who the real target was. But now you're getting all these other industries looped in, and when people see, it might sound great to say $15 an hour, which it's pretty clear they just arrived at that number because it sounds good. There's no economic analysis behind it, but as you see this happening, people who maybe supported it in theory, when they see it affecting their businesses, all of a sudden their views change.
So I wanted to circle back to talk about the reality of joblessness that we see for young people in Chicago, and talk a little bit more about how the minimum wage increase that's pending in Chicago right now. Right now, the minimum wage is $10.50 in Chicago. It's going to jump up to $13 by 2019. We already know that young men aged 20 to 24 are unemployed and they're out of school. So what's going to happen as cities like Chicago continue to jack up the minimum wage? What's going to happen to these young people? I wanted to talk a little bit more about getting that first rung on the ladder.
Well, I just know from personal experience, I was barely worth the $5 in cash I was getting paid under the table when I was 15 to wash dishes at a restaurant. So there's no way someone would have given me a chance to learn the hard and soft skills that come with even an entry-level job if they were forced to pay me $15 an hour. You're going to go, and if your business model can survive that increase, you're going to go and find more qualified workers. So how are young people supposed to get a start? And on the federal minimum wage, we do have a short-term exemption exemption for young employees that you can pay them below the minimum wage. But when states or localities raise their wages, they forget that they need to include this important exemption. So another thing to look at is if you really want to, do an economic experiment and just see what happens with raising it to $15 an hour, it would be very advisable for states and localities to look for a way to exempt young workers from these new requirements.
He is Jared Meyer. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. He is the co-author of a book entitled Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Jared, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Hey, thanks a lot.